at Buckingham Palace says the Koh-i-Noor diamond will not be used in the coronation. Instead, Camilla, the Queen Consort, will be crowned with Queen Mary's crown, which has been taken out of the Tower of London to be resized for the...
Princess Anne did not merely challenge Camilla over Queen Mary's crown. She stopped the entire plan, ordered the crown out of the display being built around Camilla's legacy, and placed Catherine at the centre of what came next. By the time Camilla walked into the secured collection room, the case was open, the crown was being lifted, and the decision she thought was still negotiable had already moved beyond her. And that was only the beginning, because Anne had not acted over a piece of jewellery. She had acted after discovering a restriction buried inside paperwork linked to Camilla's household, a restriction that appeared to reach past King Charles's reign and directly into Catherine's future as queen. Catherine had never asked for the crown. William had never challenged Camilla over it. Yet someone had already been thinking about how to stop Catherine from freely using it. That changed everything, and Catherine had no idea any of it was happening yet. The most explosive part was not even on the copy first handed to Anne. There was another version, an earlier version, and somewhere on that original proposal was a handwritten instruction that would later make Anne circle 4 words and ask a question nobody in the room wanted to answer. Who was trying to make Camilla's claim permanent, even after another queen took her place? 4 days before that confrontation, none of them knew where the story was heading. Anne arrived at Buckingham Palace for a private inspection of a major royal collection exhibition, marking 115 years since Queen Mary first wore the crown. It should have been routine, a quiet walkthrough, a few questions, perhaps a correction or two before the doors opened to the public. Then Anne stopped in front of the main display. Under carefully positioned lights sat the historic crown Camilla had worn at the 2023 coronation. Beside it was a newly prepared display card. Anne read it once. Then again. Queen Mary appeared in the text, but her history had been compressed into a handful of lines. Camilla's coronation, Camilla's use of the crown, and Camilla's modern association with it dominated everything else. Anne did not object to Camilla being there. Camilla had worn the crown. That was part of its history. What bothered her was something far more subtle. The display no longer seemed to be explaining how the crown had travelled through royal history. It seemed to be telling visitors where that history was supposed to stop. She turned to the staff and asked one simple question. Who approved this wording? Silence. One curator looked down. Another moved a stack of papers that did not need moving. Then a senior member of the exhibition team quietly approached Anne and asked whether she could spare a few minutes in a private office. There was something, he suggested, that she needed to see before she left. Royal family supporters. If you love Catherine and believe Camilla should never be allowed to push her into the background just to protect her own legacy, comment Catherine below. And if Princess Anne deserves support for standing up when others stayed silent, subscribe, like and share this video. Because it is easy to say Catherine and Anne deserve better, but real supporters do not stay silent when their place in the monarchy is being challenged. The folder waiting in that office looked ordinary. Formal pages, curatorial language, carefully worded proposals. It outlined a planned Camilla coronation collection, bringing together the crown, robes, jewellery, portraits, and other ceremonial objects associated with 2023. Anne saw nothing extraordinary in that. Royal history had always been preserved through collections, exhibitions, archives, and objects tied to important reigns. Then she reached the section concerning what would happen after Charles's reign. The wording was dry enough to miss on a quick read. Catherine could continue to display the crown in future exhibitions. Its connection to Camilla would remain protected. But if Catherine, as the next queen, wished to actually wear it for a future ceremonial purpose, special permission would be required. Anne read the sentence twice. Catherine had never asked for Queen Mary's crown. There had been no public fight, no private demand, no known competition between the two women over who would wear it next. Yet someone had already drafted a rule for Catherine before Catherine had even entered the role. That rule was designed to control. For Anne, that was the moment the exhibition ceased to matter. This was no longer about whether Camilla deserved recognition for 2023. She did. The real question was why preserving Camilla's place in history required placing a restriction on Catherine's future. Anne closed the folder, looked back toward the exhibition room, and asked for the original submission. Anne knew the answer could split the family all over again. The curator hesitated, because the document Anne had just read was only a copy, and the original contained something far worse. Anne did not leave Buckingham Palace after reading the copy. She stayed. That alone unsettled the staff. The original visit had been scheduled as a quiet inspection. But once Anne asked for the source file, the atmosphere changed. The curator who had shown her the copy did not refuse. He explained that the first submission had passed through more than one office before reaching the exhibition team. Anne wanted every version. Within the hour, 3 folders were placed on a long table in a private records room. The first contained the public exhibition language. The second held internal notes about the proposed Camilla coronation collection. The third was thicker, older, and important. It showed how the idea had evolved before anyone expected Anne to look closely. At first, the proposal appeared reasonable. The crown, the robes, selected jewels, official portraits, and ceremonial objects from 2023 would be grouped together as a historical record of Charles and Camilla's coronation. Nothing about that shocked Anne. Every reign leaves objects behind. Every reign creates an archive. Then came the restriction. The wording stated that the crown could remain available for future display, but any ceremonial use by the succeeding consort would require separate approval. The phrase was buried inside administrative language, almost designed to be skimmed past. Anne did not skim. She read it slowly. The succeeding consort. There was only one woman that phrase could realistically mean: Catherine. Anne asked whether Catherine had ever requested to wear the crown in the future. The answer was no. She asked whether William had raised the subject. Again, no. She asked whether the Wales household had been consulted before the restriction was drafted. Nobody could produce a record showing that they had. That was the point where Anne stopped treating the document as harmless planning. A condition had been written for Catherine before Catherine had even made a claim. Later that evening, Anne took the copies directly to William. Catherine was with him when the folder arrived. Neither reacted the way Anne expected. William was irritated, but cautious. He had no appetite for another family dispute becoming the center of palace life. He knew what happened whenever private disagreements escaped into public view. Every look became a headline, every silence became a feud, every seating arrangement became evidence. He told Anne that exhibition language could be corrected without turning it into a larger confrontation. Catherine was even more reluctant. She read the clause, placed the page back on the table, and made it clear that she had no intention of fighting Camilla over a crown. She did not want the object. She had never asked for it. She did not want another woman's coronation turned into a competition. For a moment, Anne said nothing. Then she looked at Catherine and gave the sentence that changed the conversation. This isn't about jewelry. It's about who gets to write the next chapter. William looked back at the document. That sentence landed because Anne had identified the real issue. The restriction was not about whether Catherine wanted the crown today. It was about whether somebody else could decide, years in advance, what Catherine would be permitted to do when William eventually became king. That was different. Completely different. Anne then pointed to another section. The proposed collection did more than preserve Camilla's place in history. It sought to keep the crown permanently associated with her name after Charles's reign. On its own, that could be explained as curatorial language. Combined with the restriction on Catherine, it looked far more deliberate. William read the paragraph again, then again. His mood changed. He asked one question. Why was Catherine being limited in a document she had never been asked to approve? No one in the room had an answer. Catherine remained calm, but the logic bothered her. She had spent years avoiding unnecessary competition inside the family. She had never publicly challenged Camilla's role. Yet this proposal seemed to imagine a future conflict before one existed. Anne saw that too. The crown had moved through history before. Queen Mary had worn it. The object had later been altered for Camilla's coronation. The monarchy had always adapted its symbols to the person and the moment. Anne believed that freezing the crown around one reign would break that pattern. William finally closed the folder. The attempt to keep the matter small was over. He wanted a meeting, not with junior staff, not with curators acting as messengers. He wanted the people responsible for the proposal in the same room, with the wording placed in front of them. Catherine still hesitated. Then Anne showed her one final line from the internal notes. The restriction was intended to survive into the next reign. William stopped reading, and this time he did not suggest compromise. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon at Buckingham Palace, behind closed doors and away from the ceremonial rooms visitors knew. There were no cameras and no staff wandering through the room. Everyone present understood that whatever was decided here would remain private until the palace chose otherwise. The atmosphere was tense. Immediately, Charles was there. Camilla was there. William and Catherine sat together on one side of the table. Anne sat opposite them with the proposal in front of her. Two royal collection officials joined them. Camilla opened carefully. She said the intention had never been to diminish Catherine. The crown had formed part of the 2023 coronation, she explained, and preserving that association was simply a matter of historical record. The planned collection was meant to protect the story of Charles's reign, not interfere with the next one. Anne listened without interrupting. Then she reached into the folder and removed an old photograph of Queen Mary. She placed it beside the proposal. Queen Mary in the photograph, Camilla's name across the modern paperwork, one crown connecting both women, but a document trying to decide what happened after them. Anne asked the question nobody expected. Then why did it belong to history before it belonged to you? Silence. Charles looked down at the papers. William did not move. Catherine remained quiet. Camilla answered first. She said nobody was claiming personal ownership. She had worn the crown during the coronation, and that moment would always be part of its history. To separate the crown would make the display incomplete. Anne agreed with one part of that. Camilla's place in the crown's history should remain. But history, Anne argued, was not the same thing as control. That was when William pulled the disputed clause toward him. He read the section dealing with future ceremonial use, then asked why Catherine would require special approval to wear a crown being treated as part of the continuing royal collection. One curator explained that the language had come through the original proposal rather than being added by the exhibition team. William looked directly at Camilla. Catherine had never asked for the crown, so why had somebody already decided she needed permission? Camilla pushed back. She said the wording was being interpreted too aggressively. Future use, she argued, could be considered when the time came. That answer changed William's expression, because when the time came meant after Charles, after the succession, after Catherine became queen. Anne asked whether the previous wearer of a royal object had ever been allowed to place permanent conditions on the succeeding reign simply because that object had become associated with them. The legal advisor chose his words carefully. Objects held within the royal collection were not ordinary private possessions. Their stewardship continued through successive sovereigns. Historical association could be recorded and protected, but permanent control over future ceremonial use raised a different question. The room shifted. This was no longer Anne against Camilla. The paperwork itself had become the problem. Charles tried to slow things down. He suggested the proposal be returned for review and the exhibition wording amended until everyone could agree on a final version. Delay. Reconsider. Anne was not interested. She said the display card could not remain as written, and the restriction could not sit quietly in a file while everyone pretended it had never been noticed. Camilla's patience began to thin. She accused Anne of turning a curatorial matter into a personal challenge. There was no reason to treat this crown as though Catherine was being denied something essential. Catherine finally spoke. She reminded the room that she had never asked for it. That sentence landed harder than anything else, because it removed the easiest defense. There had been no demand from Catherine to resist. No argument to answer, no competing claim. The restriction had appeared before the conflict it was supposedly designed to solve. William turned the page back toward Camilla. He asked who requested the clause. Again, no clear answer came. One official said the wording had arrived through Camilla's household. Another said several drafts had circulated. The legal advisor confirmed that the exhibition team had not created the restriction independently. Anne closed the folder. Then she made the move that changed the meeting. She informed Charles that she had already asked the collection team to remove the crown from the proposed permanent Camilla legacy display until the matter was resolved. Camilla stared at her. Charles looked up sharply. Even William seemed surprised. Anne had not called the meeting to ask whether the crown should be moved. She had called it to explain why it already was. Camilla demanded to know who had given Anne the authority to make that decision. Anne answered calmly. No permanent claim had been approved. No future restriction had been accepted. Until those questions were settled, the crown would remain where it belonged. With the monarchy. Not with any one person's legacy. And then Anne added something nobody in that room had been prepared to hear. She had a recommendation for who should become its next ceremonial custodian. Anne's recommendation landed before anyone had time to prepare for it. Catherine should become the crown's next ceremonial custodian. Not its owner, not its permanent keeper, not the woman allowed to rewrite its history, its custodian. The distinction mattered, and Anne made sure everyone in the room understood it. The crown would remain part of the royal collection. Camilla's use of it in 2023 would remain recorded. Queen Mary's place in its story would be restored clearly, but no household would be allowed to trap the crown inside one reign and leave the next queen asking permission to touch a symbol that was supposed to move with the monarchy. Catherine reacted first. She refused. Not dramatically, not angrily. She simply said she would not accept a role that could be presented as taking something away from Camilla. The entire dispute already carried enough tension. Accepting the crown now would make it look like victory. One woman losing, another woman winning. Catherine wanted no part of that picture. Anne did not argue immediately. William did. He turned toward Catherine and told her that refusing might feel gracious, but it would not solve the real problem. The disputed restriction would still exist in principle. Maybe not on this crown. Maybe not in this exact file. But the idea behind it would survive. That was the danger. William's point was simple. If Catherine walked away because she feared looking ambitious, then the people who drafted the restriction would have achieved the same result without ever having to defend it. Catherine looked back toward the papers. For the first time, the crown itself seemed almost secondary. This was about precedent. Anne then laid out exactly what she wanted. The exhibition would be rewritten. Queen Mary's history would no longer be compressed into a decorative footnote. Camilla's coronation would remain fully acknowledged, and the future use of the crown would no longer be governed by language created inside the present Queen's household. Then came the part that made the room even quieter. Anne wanted Catherine to accept responsibility for its next ceremonial chapter. Not because Catherine had demanded it, because she had not. That, in Anne's view, was precisely why she could be trusted with it. Royal supporters, if Catherine never asked for the crown and still found herself being restricted, should she step forward when Anne is the one defending her? Comment yes or no, and if viewers believe Catherine should not have to stay silent just to protect Camilla's feelings, then this is the moment to subscribe, like and share, because support means very little if it disappears when Catherine is the one being pushed aside. Charles remained careful. He asked whether a custodial recommendation needed to be decided that day. Anne replied that the display itself was already being changed, so postponing the principle behind it would only create another private loophole. Camilla was visibly displeased. She said the proposal was being turned into something it had never been. Her coronation collection, she argued, was supposed to preserve a historic moment, not compete with Catherine. Moving the crown now would make it appear as though her place in that history was being stripped away. Anne's answer was blunt. Nobody was removing 2023. They were removing the idea that 2023 could control what came after it. That ended the debate. Later that afternoon, Anne accompanied Catherine and William into the secured collection room. The atmosphere there was different from the meeting upstairs. No speeches, no advisors, no careful legal phrases. Just the Crown. Security staff opened the case. A curator stepped forward wearing gloves. Catherine stayed several feet back, almost as if distance itself could keep the moment from becoming personal. Then footsteps came from behind them. Camilla had arrived. She had been told there would be another discussion. What she saw instead was the Crown being prepared for removal from the legacy arrangement. She stopped. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Camilla looked toward the open case, then toward Catherine. Catherine did not smile. She did not move closer. There was no triumph in her expression, and that somehow made the scene sharper. She had not come to take anything. Anne had brought her there to accept responsibility. Camilla asked who had authorized the change. Anne answered that nothing was being transferred as private property. The Crown was returning to the continuity of the institution, where no single consort could place permanent conditions on the next. Then Anne turned toward Catherine. The room went still. "This belongs with the future now." Catherine hesitated before stepping forward. William gave the smallest nod. She accepted. Not ownership, not victory, responsibility. And for one brief moment, it appeared the confrontation had reached its end. Then Camilla said Anne had misunderstood the proposal from the beginning. Anne looked back at her. There was no anger in her face now, only interest. Because Anne had already learned that the document used in the meeting was not the first version, and she had not yet seen the original. What remained hidden there would soon change the meaning of everything. The Crown had moved, but the argument had not ended. By the next morning, the palace was dealing with the consequences of Anne's decision. Nothing had been announced publicly, yet word had spread through the small circle of staff responsible for the exhibition. Curators were rewriting labels. Advisors were reviewing the paperwork. Camilla's household wanted explanations. The Wales team wanted safeguards. Camilla did not explode. That made the atmosphere worse. She withdrew from the discussion almost completely and allowed her aides to speak for her. Her position was simple. The 2023 coronation had been one of the defining moments of Charles's reign, and removing the crown from the proposed legacy grouping made it appear as though her role in that moment was being deliberately reduced. Privately, she was said to be furious that Anne had forced the issue into a question of succession. In Camilla's view, preserving the crown's association with her coronation did not erase Catherine. It preserved a chapter that had already happened. But Catherine saw the danger from another direction. She did not want Camilla written out. That surprised some of the advisors. Catherine asked that the revised exhibition acknowledge Queen Mary properly, preserve Camilla's place in the 2023 coronation, and make clear that the crown remained part of a continuing royal story. No triumphal language. No suggestion that one woman had defeated another. No attempt to turn the display into evidence of a family feud. Her request was precise. History should remain intact. Control should not. That distinction changed the mood around William. He had entered the dispute reluctantly, but by then he was no longer focused on the crown alone. He was focused on the process that had allowed a restriction affecting his wife to appear without consultation. He asked his advisors to draft new protections around future royal collection proposals involving the Wales household. Any language that affected Catherine's ceremonial role would require independent review. Any restriction intended to survive into the next reign would need clear authorization. Any document altered after legal review would need a recorded trail showing who changed it and why. No more invisible edits, no more assumptions, no more instructions passed through private offices and treated as settled because nobody challenged them. Charles understood immediately what those protections implied. If he defended Camilla's proposal too aggressively, he risked supporting the principle that a current consort could place conditions on a successor. If he rejected it completely, Camilla would see the decision as another sign that her place in the monarchy became less secure the closer William moved toward the throne. It was an ugly choice. Charles chose the institution. He allowed Anne's recommendation to stand, while ordering that Camilla's role in the 2023 coronation remain fully represented in the exhibition. The decision was careful. The reaction was not. Camilla's household wanted to know why the matter had escalated so quickly. Anne wanted to know why it had existed at all. For several hours, that seemed to settle the matter. Staff returned to the exhibition. Catherine stepped back from the argument. William expected paperwork, not another confrontation. Anne, however, had learned enough to distrust anything that looked too neatly resolved. Then, late that afternoon, a records officer arrived with a detail nobody had expected. The version discussed at the meeting was not the earliest copy. There was another. The officer had found it attached to the original submission log, filed separately after revisions were made. It carried the same proposal number, but contained notes that did not appear in the later draft. Anne asked for it immediately. She returned to her office alone. The room was quiet, except for the turning of paper. First came the original cover sheet, then the collection proposal, then the section dealing with future association. Anne compared it line by line with the copy she had already seen. Most of the wording matched. Some phrases had been softened, others had disappeared entirely. Then she reached the margin. There, beside the paragraph about the Crown's future status, was handwriting. Not typed language, not legal wording, a handwritten amendment. Anne leaned closer. The association with Queen Camilla should remain permanent, irrespective of the succeeding consort. She read it once. Then again. Her eyes stopped on 4 words. Irrespective of the succeeding consort. There was no need to guess who that meant. William was the heir. Catherine was his wife. The succeeding consort was Catherine. Suddenly, the entire proposal looked different. This was no longer merely an attempt to preserve Camilla's coronation legacy. Someone had specifically considered the woman who would come after her and written language designed to survive that transition. Anne picked up a pen. She circled the 4 words. Then she called William, because now there was only one question left. Who had written them? William arrived within the hour. Anne had already placed the original proposal beside the later copy, the handwritten amendment facing upward between them. She did not begin with an accusation. She began with a question. Who had the authority to write that sentence? The answer was not obvious. The handwriting had never been formally attributed. No signature sat beneath it. No initials identified the writer. The records trail showed that the page had passed through Camilla's household, but that still left several possibilities. Camilla could have written it herself. A senior aide could have added it after a conversation, or someone inside her office could have believed they understood her wishes well enough to act without asking. Anne refused to guess, but she also refused to pretend the words were harmless. Irrespective of the succeeding consort, William read them again. The phrase did not preserve history. It anticipated Catherine. It imagined the next reign and tried to place a condition inside it before William had even become king. That ended the debate, and everyone understood the stakes. William asked for the legal review to be reopened, not because he wanted Camilla blamed, but because the amendment changed the purpose of the proposal. What had been described as a legacy arrangement now contained language directed at the woman expected to follow Camilla as queen. Catherine was called in later. She stood over the document without touching it. There was no satisfaction in her reaction. No victory. If anything, the discovery made the dispute more uncomfortable. Catherine had spent days insisting she did not want a battle. Now the paperwork suggested the battle had been prepared before she even knew it existed. Anne made her position clear. The handwritten amendment could not stand. The restriction would be removed. The proposal would be withdrawn. Any future exhibition plan involving the crown would have to pass through independent review, with no language allowing one household to bind the next. Charles accepted that conclusion. Quietly. He would not authorize a public confrontation over handwriting that had not been proven to belong to any one person. But he would not defend a clause that appeared to reach beyond his reign. That settled the institutional question. It did not settle the family question. Inside Camilla's household, the search for an explanation became urgent. Who added the line? Who saw it before submission? Why had it vanished from the later copy? And had the wording been removed because somebody realized how damaging it looked? Those questions remained unanswered. The exhibition team received new instructions. Queen Mary's connection to the crown would be restored. Camilla's role in the 2023 coronation would remain acknowledged. Catherine's future position would not be restricted. The crown would continue forward. That was the principle Anne had fought for from the beginning. Catherine remained its next ceremonial custodian, but she insisted on one condition of her own. Nothing in the revised display should suggest that Camilla had been erased. That mattered, because Catherine did not want revenge written into royal history any more than Anne wanted ownership written into it. Queen Mary had worn the crown. Camilla had worn it. Catherine might wear it one day. Each woman represented a moment. The institution was supposed to outlive them all. And that was why Anne's intervention became so powerful. She had not merely moved a crown. She had challenged the idea that anyone could freeze royal history around themselves and expect the future to ask permission. But one mystery remained: the handwriting. Anne kept a copy. William's advisors kept another. Inside the records office, staff began comparing the amendment against notes held from Camilla's household. No public accusation followed. Not yet. Royal watchers, if Anne was right to stop Catherine's future from being restricted, do not leave without making that support visible. Comment Anne was right, like the video, share it with someone who believes royal history should move forward, and subscribe. Because when Catherine never asked for the crown yet limits were still placed around her, silence only protects the people who expected nobody to notice. The final decision was simple. The amendment was invalid. The restriction was gone. The crown remained part of the continuing monarchy, and Catherine was no longer entering the future under somebody else's conditions. But the story did not end with that page. In the next video, attention turns to a separate palace file recovered during the same records review. One line inside it names a senior member of Camilla's household, and beside that name sits a handwritten instruction dated before the crown proposal was formally submitted. That detail could finally reveal who knew about the restriction first. And once that name is exposed, the question will no longer be who wrote the sentence. It will be who ordered it.